All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're cracking open a text called Celestial Ship of the North, and it's got a pretty wild idea at its core. It suggests that our most ancient myths, our oldest religions, they aren't just stories. Nope, they're actually a kind of scientific code, a secret language written in the stars. Let's see what it has to say.
So, let's kick things off with a huge mystery. Have you ever wondered why ancient cultures, people separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all seem to tell the same kinds of stories? You've got virgin births, gods who die only to be resurrected, great floods, massive battles between light and dark. They pop up everywhere. Is that just a massive coincidence? Well, the source we're digging into today says, no way. It's not a coincidence. It's evidence of a shared ancient blueprint.
So to really get our heads around this, here's the plan for our explainer. First up, we'll explore this idea of a secret language in the sky. Then we'll try to trace this language back to its supposed origins in ancient Egypt. From there, we'll get into the good stuff, decoding how gods are really just stand-ins for the sun and moon. We'll also break down some of those universal symbols you see everywhere. And finally, we'll wrap up by asking a pretty big question. Was myth actually a kind of forgotten science? Okay, so first things first. The biggest idea we have to tackle is that we need to completely reframe what we think a myth even is. The source argues that for centuries, we've been reading these ancient stories completely wrong. They aren't just primitive superstitions or, made-up tales. They're a highly sophisticated language, a code that was built to pass down some seriously deep knowledge.
The name for this whole theory is astrotheology, and it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that at the root of all theology, all our stories about gods, you're actually going to find astronomy. It's saying that humanity's foundational stories, the lies of the gods, the creation of the world, are really just elaborate, beautiful allegories for what's happening up in the sky with the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars.
There's this 19th century scholar named Gerald Massey, who our source leans on heavily, and he put it perfectly. He said mythology wasn't about falsifying reality. It was a way of conveying it. Those fables, he said, were just the delivery system for hard facts. So what he's suggesting is when the ancients told a story about a god dying and being reborn, they might have actually been giving a lecture on solar mechanics.
Okay, so if we accept for a second that mythology is this grand celestial code, the next obvious question is who wrote it, right? Who are the original cosmic code breakers? Well, to answer that, we've got to go way, way back. And according to this text, all signs point to one very specific place in the ancient world.
The source makes a really strong case that this all started in ancient Egypt and Inner Africa. The argument is that the Egyptians were the very first people to systematically chart the heavens, to name the stars, and to map them all out. The text even argues that the mythological Garden of Eden wasn't some fantasy land, but a real location, Equatorial Africa. And it points to cultural clues, noting that early statues of major figures like Buddha in India and the goddess Diana are depicted with what the author calls Negroid features, suggesting that these core ideas have an African lineage. The very same claim is made about the Great Sphinx.
And to really hammer this point home, the source brings in the work of a Professor Lepsius. His claim was pretty bold. He said that at the dawn of history, there was really only one game in town when it came to advanced culture: Egypt. He argued that Babylonian civilization was basically just an Egyptian colony, that their incredible astronomy was only a development of what Egypt had already figured out, and that their architecture was just an imperfect imitation. So the central idea here is that this celestial knowledge started in Egypt and then spread out to the rest of the world.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the where. Now for the really fun part, the how. How does this code actually work in practice? This is where we get to roll up our sleeves and see the theory in action, decoding the lives of gods as the epic journeys of the sun and moon across the sky.
Now here is the absolute game changer. That story of the dying and rising god, a figure you see in tons of cultures, is not meant to be taken as a historical event. Not at all. It's a beautiful, poetic, personified description of the sun's annual cycle. It's about its metaphorical death in the dead of winter and its glorious rebirth in the spring. Let's actually map this out. So, in the Egyptian version, the sun god Osiris is betrayed and killed right as the sun enters the zodiac sign of Scorpio. That's the autumnal equinox. It begins its descent into the darkness of winter. This kicks off a 40-day period of mourning, a tradition the source says was kept alive in ancient mystery schools and, much later, became Christian Lent. But then, on the third day after his death, Osiris rises again. But here's the twist. He rises not as the sun, but as the light reflected in the moon. That's the lunar resurrection. The full-blown, glorious solar resurrection doesn't happen until the vernal equinox, when the sun finally overpowers the darkness and spring officially begins.
And this is where the source draws some, well, pretty striking parallels to the gospel story. You have the death and resurrection of Osiris mirroring the story of Jesus. The Egyptian myths talk about two phases of the god Horus, the child and then the adult who starts his ministry at age 30, just like Jesus. And then there are those two distinct risings, one after 3 days and a final one after 40 days. In the astronomical myth, this lines up perfectly with the lunar and solar events. The text basically argues that when you put on these astrotheology glasses, stories that seem contradictory suddenly start to make a whole lot of sense.
But it wasn't just these huge epic stories that were encoded with star knowledge. According to the source, even the most basic, most universal symbols that we still see all around us today are absolutely packed with astronomical meaning. Let's decode a few of the big ones.
Let's start with the cross. It's one of the oldest symbols in human history, found way before Christianity. According to this theory, it's not what we think it is. It's a map of the solar year. The circle around it is the zodiac, the sun's path through the sky, and the 4 arms of the cross, they mark the 4 crucial turning points of the year, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. It's a symbol of the sun's complete journey. It's a calendar.
So what about the serpent or the dragon? Today we kind of think of it as a symbol of evil, right? But the source says its original meaning was way more profound and, frankly, way cooler. A serpent biting its own tail is a perfect symbol for eternity. The way it sheds its skin, come on, that's the ultimate metaphor for renewal and resurrection. And its coiled shape was meant to represent the slow, spiral wobble of the Earth's axis over thousands of years, a concept we now call the precession of the equinoxes. So the serpent wasn't evil, it was a symbol of time itself.
And finally, the tree of life. You see this one everywhere, too. The idea here is that it wasn't some magical plant, it was an ancient infographic of the cosmos. Its branches literally grew as humanity's understanding of the heavens grew. It started with just 2 branches for the 2 celestial poles, then it grew to 4 for the cardinal points, then 7 for the visible planets, 12 for the zodiac signs, and eventually 72 branches for even smaller divisions of the sky. It's a complete evolving map of space and time.
So, after all that, where does this leave us? If these incredible stories and powerful symbols are really just a sophisticated astronomical code, then it means something pretty profound. It implies that myth wasn't primitive religion. It was a form of science, a science that for the most part, we've completely forgotten how to read.
The source really draws a line in the sand between 2 totally different worldviews. On one side, you have the ancient perspective. They looked up at the night sky and saw living bodies, divine intelligences moving with purpose, and they created myths as a scientific language to describe it all. On the other side, you have us, the modern perspective. We look up and see masses of light or chunks of rock moving according to cold, hard physical laws. And while we've definitely gained a lot of knowledge, the source is asking, did we lose something just as valuable when we decided to dismiss myth as nothing more than superstition?
And that brings us to this final, really thought-provoking quote. The mythos does explain the fact, but only by abolishing the history. What a line. The argument here is simple. When we try to read these ancient texts as literal history, we run into endless contradictions and impossibilities. But the moment we read them as astronomical allegory, as mythos, all those contradictions just melt away and a stunningly coherent scientific system appears. The explanation is there, but getting to it means we have to let go of reading these stories as literal history.
So we're going to end on this thought. What this source is asking us to consider is that our oldest stories aren't childish fairy tales. They might just be a legacy of incredible scientific wisdom, encoded in the only language that could possibly survive for millennia, the language of myth and symbol. It suggests our ancestors weren't primitive at all. They were brilliant astronomers who mapped the entire cosmos. And that leaves us with one heck of a question to chew on. If our myths really are a forgotten map of the stars, what else have we failed to see?